Emily Thompson never imagined that her life could unravel so completely in a single day. She remembered the morning Mark left as if it had happened just yesterday, the way the sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, painting warm streaks across the marble countertop. He stood by the sink, sipping coffee with one hand, scrolling through his phone with the other. He looked calm, normal, as though he wasn't about to vanish from her life forever. "Don't forget dinner tonight," she called over her shoulder as she packed her laptop bag. "We're meeting the Petersons at 7. He smiled, that easy, charming smile he always had. "I'll be there. Don't worry." Those were the last words he ever said to her. When Mark didn't show up for dinner, Emily was more confused than worried. It wasn't like him to forget plans, especially not with the Petersons, their close friends. She texted him. No response. She called twice. Straight to voicemail. By 9 p.m., confusion turned to irritation. He was probably working late and forgot to charge his phone. It wouldn't be the first time. By midnight, irritation shifted to fear. Emily sat curled up on the couch, phone clutched in her hand, listening to the clock tick louder with every passing second. She called the hospitals. Nothing. She called his colleagues. No one had seen him since he left the office at 4 p.m. When she finally called the police, her voice trembled. "My husband didn't come home. He's missing." The next few days were a blur of unanswered questions and rising panic. The police found his car 2 days later, parked near a remote lake about 30 miles outside the city. The keys were still in the ignition. His wallet was inside, untouched. The doors were locked. A pair of Mark's shoes sat neatly by the shoreline, as if he'd taken them off before going for a swim. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the most obvious conclusion: accidental drowning. The area was known for its strong undercurrents. People went missing there every year. The police assured Emily it was likely a tragic accident. They dragged the lake, searched the surrounding woods, but no body was ever found. No body meant no closure. Emily wanted to believe them. She wanted to believe Mark was gone, because the alternative was too painful to comprehend. But something didn't add up. Mark wasn't the kind of man who went for quiet walks by the lake. He hated the outdoors. He hated swimming. Why would he go there, of all places? And why leave his shoes so neatly by the shore, like a staged crime scene from a TV show? She voiced these concerns to the detective assigned to the case, but he only nodded sympathetically. "Grief does strange things to people," he said. "Sometimes when we don't have answers, our minds try to fill in the gaps." Emily wasn't satisfied with that. She threw herself into finding answers, combing through phone records, bank statements, emails. Anything that might explain why he had been in that area. She expected to find something. An affair, a gambling problem, a secret he'd been hiding. But there was nothing. His bank accounts were untouched. His last phone call was to her. As the weeks dragged on, the world moved on without her. Friends stopped calling as often. The initial flood of casseroles and sympathy cards slowed to a trickle. The police labeled the case open but inactive. Eventually, even Emily's closest friends gently urged her to accept the truth. "You need to start thinking about how to move forward," they said. "Mark wouldn't want you to be stuck like this." But Emily was stuck. She couldn't move forward because something deep inside her refused to let go. She clung to hope, though she hated herself for it. Hope is cruel when it's tied to a ghost. 2 months after Mark's disappearance, Emily found herself sitting on the cold floor of their bedroom closet, surrounded by his clothes. She breathed in the fading scent of his cologne and wondered if she was losing her mind. People die. Husbands drown. These things happen every day. Why couldn't she believe it? And yet the nagging feeling persisted. The absence of proof felt like proof in itself. She started dreaming about him. In the dreams, he was always just out of reach, walking ahead of her in a crowded street, disappearing around corners before she could catch up. She'd wake up gasping, heart pounding, half expecting to see him lying next to her in bed. But the other side of the bed was always cold. The months dragged on. She stopped going to work. She stopped returning phone calls. She spent hours scrolling through online forums for missing persons cases, reading about wives who never found their husbands. She started recognizing their pain in herself, the way they clung to every rumor, every supposed sighting. She told herself she didn't want to be like them, but she was. A year passed. Then two. By the second anniversary of Mark's disappearance, Emily felt hollowed out. She had learned to function again, at least on the surface. She went back to work. She smiled when people asked how she was doing. She even went on a couple of dates, though the men never made it past dinner. They weren't Mark. No one was Mark. She had almost convinced herself that she was starting to move on when it happened. It was late one night, and she was scrolling mindlessly through social media when a photo caught her eye. It wasn't even the subject of the photo that mattered. It was the background. A group of people stood laughing outside a crowded restaurant in another state. But behind them, half obscured by shadows, was a man who looked exactly like Mark. Her heart stopped. She stared at the photo until her vision blurred. Couldn't be him. It had to be someone else. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became. The way he tilted his head. The way he stood. Even the shirt he was wearing looked familiar. Hands shaking, Emily clicked on the profile that had posted the picture. She scrolled through the photos looking for more. Her heart pounded louder with every swipe. And then she found it. Another photo, clearer this time. It was him. She knew it the way she knew her own reflection. Mark Thompson was alive. And he had a new life. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the photo on her screen. The man in the picture wasn't just a passing resemblance or some cruel trick of her exhausted mind. It was Mark. His hair was a little shorter, his beard slightly thicker, but it was him. She could tell by the way he tilted his head when he laughed, the faint scar along his jawline from a bike accident when he was 15. He wasn't dead. He was alive. And he looked happy. Her heart pounded so violently it hurt. She gasped for air, barely able to process what she was seeing. 2 years. 2 years of grieving, of crying herself to sleep, of clutching his old t-shirts just to feel close to him, and the whole time he was out there living a new life. He hadn't drowned. He hadn't been taken from her. He had left. On purpose. Shock gave way to rage so quickly it made her dizzy. Her whole body burned with it. She wanted to scream, to throw her phone across the room. But she couldn't look away from the picture. She clicked on the profile again. It belonged to a woman named Rebecca Miller. Scrolling through her photos, Emily's stomach twisted. Rebecca was beautiful, tall, dark-haired, and full of the kind of effortless confidence Emily had always envied. She looked about 10 years younger than Emily. And Mark was everywhere. Emily scrolled through picture after picture, her pulse racing. There he was at a backyard barbecue, smiling with his arm around Rebecca's waist. There he was on a hiking trip, something he had always sworn he hated. In one photo he stood with a group of friends, holding a beer and laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. Like he wasn't supposed to be dead. Emily spent the rest of the night poring over Rebecca's profile, piecing together the life Mark had built. They lived in another state hundreds of miles away. According to the comments, they had been together for about a year. A year. That meant he had waited less than a year after faking his death to start a new relationship. Or maybe it had started before. Maybe she was the reason he left. The thought made Emily feel sick. By the time the sun started to rise, Emily had gathered enough information to confirm what she already knew. Mark hadn't just run away. He had built an entirely new identity. He was going by the name Daniel right now. He had a new job, a new home, and a new fiancé. Emily's heart twisted painfully at that last part. A fiancé. He was getting married again. She wanted to call the police right then and there. Faking your death wasn't just immoral. It was illegal. Identity fraud. Insurance fraud. There had to be consequences for what he'd done. But the more she thought about it, the less satisfied it made her feel. She didn't just want him to pay. She wanted answers. She wanted to know why he had done this. Why he had left her. Why he had let her mourn him for 2 years, while he built a shiny new life with someone else. Emily knew she couldn't go to the police, not yet. She needed proof. Real proof. Social media pictures weren't enough. She needed to see him in person. She hired a private investigator the next day. His name was Paul Riley, a retired detective with a no-nonsense attitude and a reputation for getting results. She showed him the photos and explained the situation, expecting him to look at her like she was crazy. But he didn't. "I've seen worse," Paul said. "Believe it or not, this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think." That only made Emily feel worse. Over the next 2 weeks, Paul dug into Mark's new life. He confirmed what Emily had already found. His new identity was clean. Fake but clean. New social security number. New driver's license. He even owned a house with Rebecca, a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He had a new job as a financial consultant at a small firm. He wasn't hiding. He was living openly, like he had nothing to fear. It made Emily furious. How does someone even pull this off? She asked Paul one afternoon, her voice trembling with frustration. How do you fake your death and walk away like it's nothing? With money, Paul said. And planning. He probably started preparing months before he left. Maybe longer. Months. Emily thought back to the months leading up to Mark's disappearance. Had there been signs? She tried to remember if he'd acted differently, if there had been any red flags she'd missed. But there was nothing. He'd been the same Mark he always was. Loving. Reliable. Or maybe she'd just been blind. One afternoon, Paul called with an update. I found something you're gonna want to see, he said. Rebecca posted their engagement announcement. Emily's heart sank as she opened the link he sent. There it was, a bright smiling photo of Mark and Rebecca with the words "Can't wait to marry my best friend. May 20th. In the caption, May 20th. 3 weeks away. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen until the words blurred. He was going to marry her. He was really going to go through with it. What do you want to do? Paul asked. Emily closed her eyes and took a slow, steadying breath. I want to be there, she said. Paul hesitated. You sure about that? She wasn't. But she nodded anyway. I need to hear him say it. I need to hear him tell me why. For the next few weeks, Emily prepared herself for what she was about to do. She played out the confrontation over and over again in her head, imagining all the different ways it could go. Would he be shocked to see her? Angry? Would he try to deny it? Would he cry? She wasn't sure which outcome she wanted. Part of her wanted him to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. Another part of her wanted to see him squirm, to watch him feel the same pain she had felt for 2 years. But more than anything, she wanted closure. On the day of the wedding, Emily packed a bag and drove to the small town where Mark and Rebecca lived. She parked down the street from the venue, a quaint outdoor garden surrounded by trees. She sat in her car for nearly an hour, watching the guests arrive. Watching him arrive. When she saw him step out of the car in a tailored suit, laughing with his groomsmen, it felt like someone had punched her in the chest. He looked so normal, so unaffected. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. This wasn't the man she had married. This was a stranger. And she was about to introduce herself. Emily's palms were slick with sweat as she sat in her car, staring at the wedding venue down the street. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the weeks leading up to it. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure she could go through with it. She watched the guests file in, laughing and chatting as they made their way through the garden gates. Everything about the scene was picture perfect. White chairs lined up in neat rows, delicate string lights woven through the trees, the gentle hum of violin music floating on the breeze. It was the kind of wedding Emily had once dreamed of having with Mark. Except this wasn't Mark. Not anymore. He was Daniel right now, a new man with a new life. And today, he was marrying someone else. Emily's stomach churned violently. She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths to steady herself. She had to do this. She hadn't come all this way to sit in her car and cry. She needed answers. She needed closure. And if she was honest, part of her just wanted to watch his world burn. Finally, she pushed the car door open and stepped out. The air was warm, thick with the scent of fresh flowers. Emily smoothed the front of her dress, wiped her sweaty palms against the fabric, and started walking. Her legs felt heavy, as if her body were resisting every step. By the time she reached the garden entrance, the ceremony was about to start. Guests were already seated, murmuring quietly as the music swelled. Emily hung back near the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. She spotted Mark near the altar, standing with his groomsmen, his back to her. He looked calm, relaxed, like a man with nothing to hide. Emily's breath caught painfully in her chest. How could he look so at ease while she felt like she was coming apart at the seams? How could he stand there, ready to pledge his life to someone else, when he had left her in the dark for 2 years. The music shifted. Heads turned toward the aisle. Emily watched as Rebecca appeared, radiant in a flowing white dress. She was smiling so brightly it hurt to look at her. The crowd let out a collective sigh as she started her slow walk toward the altar. Emily's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She could feel the anger building inside her, hot and relentless. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But instead, she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped forward. Her heels clicked against the stone pathway, cutting through the soft murmur of the crowd. A few people turned to look at her, their expressions curious, then confused, then alarmed. By the time Emily reached the center aisle, the entire crowd had gone silent. "Stop." Her voice rang out clear and steady, even though her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Mark, or Daniel, as he called himself now, turned slowly at the sound of her voice. His expression shifted from confusion to shock in an instant. His face drained of color. "Emily," he breathed. The way he said her name, soft, barely audible, made her stomach twist. It was the way he used to say it when they were lying in bed late at night, his voice warm and gentle. But now it sounded hollow. Rebecca turned to him, her smile faltering. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily folded her arms, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm his wife." The words fell like a bomb. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People whispered, heads turning, eyes wide. Rebecca stared at Emily, then back at Mark. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked. Her voice was shaking now. "Daniel, what is she talking about?" Emily stepped forward, holding her phone in her hand. "It's not a joke. His real name is Mark Thompson. He faked his death 2 years ago. I thought he drowned. I mourned him. I buried an empty casket. You faked your death to get away from me. You let me grieve for 2 years. And now you want to talk in private?" She shook her head. "No, we're doing this right here." Rebecca turned back to him, tears welling in her eyes. "Is it true? You always wanted to fix everything." The words hit her like a slap. She felt the sting of them deep in her chest. "You're blaming me for this?" Mark shook his head. "I'm sorry, Emily. I really am. But I had to start over." Rebecca was crying now. "I trusted you," she said. "I thought I knew you." Mark reached for her. "Rebecca, please." She pulled away. "Don't touch me." And all this time he was here. With you. Rebecca stumbled back a step, shaking her head. No, that's not possible." "Mark," Emily said, turning to him. "Go ahead. Tell her I'm lying." Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with panic. He looked around the crowd as if searching for an escape. "Emily," he finally said, his voice low. "Can we talk about this somewhere private?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Private?" Mark hesitated. That hesitation was all the answer she needed. "Oh my God," she whispered, stepping back from him. "You lied to me." The guests were on their feet now, some filming on their phones, others standing in stunned silence. Emily could hear the whispers all around her. "Who does that? Did he really fake his death? This is insane." Mark finally threw up his hands. "What was I supposed to do?" he shouted. "We were miserable, Emily. We were falling apart. I couldn't do it anymore." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "So you left? You left without a word. You let me think you were dead. Do you know what that did to me? I didn't know how else to get out," he said, his voice breaking. "I felt trapped. I thought this was the only way." Emily's chest ached with fury. "You could have divorced me. I tried." He snapped. "You wouldn't listen. You wanted to fix everything." Emily felt the weight of 2 years of grief, anger, and heartbreak pressing down on her. She had imagined this moment so many times. Imagined screaming at him, demanding answers, making him suffer the way she had suffered. But now standing here she felt tired. She looked at him, this man she had once loved more than anything, and realized he wasn't the same person anymore. Maybe he never was. "I hope it was worth it," she said quietly, "because now everyone knows who you really are." And with that she turned and walked away. The aftermath of the wedding crash played out like a scene from a movie, but not the kind with a happy ending. By the time Emily made it back to her car, Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. The sound of whispers and gasps from the crowd still echoed in her ears. She could see Mark's face every time she closed her eyes. The shock, the panic, the way he had tried to twist the blame back on her. As she pulled onto the road, her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages. Some were from Paul Riley, the private investigator, asking if she was okay. Others were from unknown numbers, reporters, she realized with a sinking feeling. News of the confrontation had spread fast. Someone must have posted a video online. Of course they had. Emily didn't stop driving until she reached the outskirts of town. She pulled into a gas station, parked in the back lot, and rested her head against the steering wheel. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her drained and hollow. She had waited 2 years for answers. 2 years of grieving, of wondering what she had done wrong. And now she finally knew the truth. It was him. It had always been him. He hadn't left because of some tragic misunderstanding. He hadn't left because their marriage was impossible to fix. He had left because he was a coward. A man who would rather fake his death than face the reality of a difficult marriage. Emily exhaled slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She wasn't going to cry over him anymore. He didn't deserve her tears. When she finally checked her phone again, there were dozens of notifications. Her heart sank as she opened one of the videos someone had posted online. There was the entire confrontation filmed from the crowd. Over 200,000 views in just a few hours. Comments poured in, some sympathetic, others cruel. Good for her, what a legend. This is insane. Who does that? Y'all seriously believe this? It looks staged. Emily turned the phone off. She didn't care what strangers thought. Let the world talk. Let them judge. She had spent 2 years living in the shadow of a lie. This wasn't her shame to carry anymore. The next day, the media frenzy hit full force. Reporters camped outside her house. News outlets ran the story with headlines like "Runaway Husband Fakes Death." "Ex-wife crashes his wedding, until death do us part?" Not for this groom. Paul called to warn her. "This is going to be everywhere for a while," he said. "You might want to lay low." Emily laughed bitterly. "I've been laying low for 2 years," she said. "I'm done hiding." And she meant it. For the first time since Mark's disappearance, she didn't feel the need to retreat. She wasn't the victim here. He was the one who should be hiding. Over the next few days, more details emerged. Rebecca had called off the wedding immediately after the confrontation. She released a brief statement through social media, apologizing to her friends and family, saying she had been blindsided by a man who turned out to be a fraud. Mark, on the other hand, had gone into hiding. Reporters tracked down some of his former colleagues and friends. One of them confirmed what Emily had suspected. Mark had been planning his disappearance for months before he left. He'd been moving money into a private account, creating a new identity, and making it look like he was drowning in debt when in reality he was hoarding cash. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was premeditated. Emily met with a lawyer to explore her options. What he did wasn't just cruel. It was illegal, the lawyer told her. Identity fraud, insurance fraud. There are consequences for this. But Emily wasn't sure if pressing charges would give her the closure she was looking for. Would seeing him in jail make her feel better? Or would it just keep her tied to him for longer? She wrestled with the decision for days. She had spent so long consumed by what Mark had done, the lies, the abandonment, that she wasn't sure who she was without the anger. What would her life look like if she just let it go? One afternoon, she found herself back at the lake where Mark had supposedly drowned. She sat on the shore, watching the water ripple under the breeze. This was where her grief had started. The place where she had mourned him, where she had begged for answers that never came. But now she knew the truth. And as painful as it was, there was something freeing about it. She picked up a small stone and held it in her palm, feeling its weight. She thought about all the years she had spent carrying the weight of Mark's choices. The way she had blamed herself. The way she had clung to hope, even when it hurt. It was time to let it go. She threw the stone into the water and watched it disappear beneath the surface. In the end, Emily chose not to press charges. She wasn't doing it for him. She was doing it for herself. She was done letting him dictate the terms of her life. Let him run. Let him hide. She wasn't going to spend another second chasing him. Instead, she focused on rebuilding. She reconnected with old friends, went back to work, and started therapy. She joined a support group for people who had experienced betrayal and found comfort in hearing other people's stories. She wasn't alone. One day, after a meeting, someone asked her how she had managed to forgive him. Emily smiled softly. "I didn't," she said. "I forgave myself. It wasn't about him anymore. It never had been." And as she walked away from the meeting, the sun warm on her face, Emily realized something she hadn't felt in years. She was free.